Hello to Andrew Appleby and the John Rae Society in the Orphir Community Hall. I'm delighted to say we have Dr. Maria Pia Casarini, the polar historian, with us to join you just now, and she'll be followed by Professor Peter Wadhams, the specialist on the polar ice and indeed ice everywhere. So, Pia, first of all, welcome to you. Now, if all goes well, there'll be a lot of happy people in the Orphir Community Hall who've just been enjoying tea with what Andrew has been assuring me is some very good cake. And they are looking forward to your story about John Rae. So, Pia, I'm delighted to welcome you and to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's such a shame we can't be with you, but we are assured of your friendship and your warmth, so we can feel it all the way to Italy. We can start the slide, please. Thank you very much. So the names of Dr. John Rae and of Sir John Franklin are inextricably linked in the history of discovery of the Northwest Passage. And the town of Stromness is also involved in this history, as it was the last place in Europe that saw Franklin and his men alive in 1845, before their departure for the Arctic in search of the Northwest Passage. In fact, I have been told, for a few years I was in Kirkwall, that it was at the last reception ever given for Sir John Franklin that the waltz was first danced in Stromness. In this afternoon, which is in honor of Dr. John Rae, let us consider how he became the best and most accomplished Arctic traveler of all times, and highlight the fundamental contributions to solve the issue of the Northwest Passage. The Hudson's Bay Company in itself is so much part of the past history of Orkney, was instrumental in the geographical exploration of the Canadian Arctic. Next, please. Thanks to George Simpson, became Sir George Simpson in 1841, the ambitious overseas governor of the Hudson's Bay Company. Thanks to him, he contributed a great deal to the knowledge of that area of the world. He showed his interest in geographical discoveries. Next, please. When he sent Chief Factor Warren Dease and Thomas Simpson, his cousin, in 1837-39 to join up the discoveries of expeditions to the west and east of the Mackenzie River. We see that Dease and Simpson blue line that you can see more or less halfway in this slide. Unfortunately, I can't show you. I don't know if you see it. Anyway, this is the blue line that Dease and Simpson followed. And they mapped 100 miles of new land, stopping short of unraveling the puzzle of the area which was to the east of King William Island and Boothia Peninsula. Next slide, please. In the meantime, Dr. John Rae, who had joined the Hudson's Bay Company in 1833 at the age of 20 as a surgeon, just for a year, had remained in Canada at the service of the company and was learning the native methods of travel and survival in that cold, inhospitable region. This was the greatest difference between the Royal Navy expedition, John Rae, and the greatest criticism leveled at him by the establishment of going native. His way, early in light, often alone, living off the land by killing animals he encountered, using clothes served populations for millennia, proved to be a winning combination. Next, please. In 1844, he was given this task by George Simpson to complete the survey of the still remained explored, that is the coastline of the North American continent west of Hudson Bay, to join these and Simpson's discoveries. What better person than John Rae, young, perfectly fit, well-versed in the way of surviving any circumstances, an excellent hunter, capable and intelligent. That was a letter that you're seeing of John Rae in 1844, when he said, an idea has entered my mind that you are one of the fittest men in the country to conduct an expedition for the purpose of completing the survey of the northern coast that remained untraced, say between the Straits of Fury and Hecla and the Gulf of Busia, from whence Dease and Simpson returned. Those years, 1834 to 1844, were very happy for John Rae. He felt in physical top for John Simpson's proposal. Next, please. In 1845, there was still a great to be discovered in the Canadian Arctic. Despite a number of expeditions, there was still a lot of blank areas in the area. Next. And this is why in 1845, the Royal Navy sent Sir John Franklin with the Erebus and Terror to find a northwest passage. Next one, please. In 1846-47, while trying to sway through the Northwest Passage, Rae explored the area around the eastern side of Busia. This is the dark blue line. Traced the coastline of Melville Island here on the right, and they built his winter quarters at Repulse Bay, right at the bottom in the little triangle that you can see, also enlarged on the left, bottom left of this slide. And he named his dwelling Fort Hope and clearly saw, but did not reach, an isthmus that linked the continent to Busia, proving that Busia was not an island. This major discovery was later discounted by the Admiralty. In fact, the Admiralty charts published in later years still showed a dotted line in the area, causing Rae much annoyance. Next, please. And these were the results of the first Arctic expedition of John Rae. He confirmed that there was no sea opening west of Hudson Bay. He mapped about 625 miles of unknown coast, established, as we just said, that Busia was a peninsula, but it was seen from a distance. Okay, next, please. In 1847, Rae was in London for a well-deserved time away from the Arctic. His first visit back home for 14 years, when he was approached by Sir John Richardson, who we see here, the well-respected Royal Navy surgeon, a relative of Sir John Franklin's through marriage to one of his nieces, and Franklin's companion in both his land expeditions that happened in the early 1820s. By 1847, there was an increasing concern about the absence of news from the Franklin expedition, last heard of when they from Greenland in 1845. Next, please. And there were some quarters, especially Lady Franklin, that an expedition should be sent out to find them and possible rescue them. Next. What would be the better person for this task than John Rae, strong, fit, experienced in traveling in the north and used to living off the land? Richardson obtained what he wanted. John Rae, second in command in this Admiralty expedition released by the Hudson's Bay Company. Richardson and Rae left England together in 1848, bound for Hudson Bay. 20 servicemen from the Royal Navy joined them, but Rae was unimpressed by them, to say the least, describing them as the most awkward, lazy, and careless set I ever had anything to do with. Next. The route that they followed did not cover any new discovery. You can follow the red line at the left of this map. They simply were looking for traces of the Franklin expedition, but none were found. And when Sir George Richardson returned to England in 1849, Rae was promoted to chief trader in charge of the Mackenzie River district, based at Fort Simpson. He was asked again to travel to the coast in 1849. Next, please. So this second Arctic expedition was in a way the least successful because there was no new territory surveyed, but Rae had never actually seen that coastline, so that was something useful for him to increase his experience and knowledge of the Arctic. Next. In those years, the Franklin searches had reached frantic proportion. Ships were sent by the Admiralty. Expeditions were organized by the United States. Lady Franklin sent 2 private expeditions in 1850 and 1851. Nothing was accomplished and no traces were found of the lost sailors. Next, please. So, Dr. John Rae, after being promoted chief factor in 1850, his services were required for another search expedition. Sir George Simpson was not pleased, as he said to the Admiralty. The continued absence of Chief Factor Rae from the charge of the important district of Mackenzie River is attended with very serious inconvenience to the business. Well, after all, the Hudson's Bay Company was there to make money. And if one of his star people was co-opted to search for Franklin, that was certainly detrimental to business. Next, please. Can do 3 in quick sequence. That's Rae was, as I said, the most accomplished Arctic explorer. He had devised snowshoes. He knew how to build snow houses. And next, also the Halkett boat that people in Orkney can admire, one in the Stromness Museum, which was very, very nicely packed and very portable and exceedingly useful when moving in the Arctic. Next, so he was sent in that expedition, it's the light blue track south of Victoria Island. In fact, nobody knew at the time that Victoria Island was in fact an island, because by seeing little bits at the time, people just expected that it was part of a wider area of land. And so he went across these and Simpson Strait. And at one point, he was only about 40 miles from the west coast of King William Island, that we see here. Unknown to him and to anyone, the Franklin expedition had reached its end in that area. Heavy ice did not permit him to cross Victoria Strait. And this was the closest point of the Franklin tragedy. On the return journey west, can you imagine, Rae found 2 pieces of wood that were recognized later on as being part of a ship, one with a British government mark, the other which seemed to be a stanchion. Next, please. This was Rae's most successful expedition, and he gained great personal satisfaction. He had walked over 1,000 miles, had mapped 330 miles of unexplored coastline, and his boat exploration had been successful too. And by the time of his return to Canada, he had already proposed to the Hudson's Bay Company another expedition to map the west coast of Boothia in order to complete the survey of the North American continent. Next. And this expedition started straight away in 1853. And that would be the yellow line that flanks the western side of Hudson's Bay. by following this unknown river, he deviated from his plan, which was actually to follow Chesterfield Inlet. And he was quite frustrated about the time that he had wasted. Then he, instead of going through Chesterfield Inlet, just south of that little river that didn't take him anywhere, he went back instead to the place, and we can see the enlarged part at the bottom left, where if he had managed to get to the Chesterfield Inlet and the Backfish River, he would have found himself in the middle of the tragedy of Franklin. Instead, he went back, reaching his step of 1846, and wintered at Fort Hope, right at the bottom of this square here. And when he went, and then in the spring, he went west towards Busia, which was exactly what he wanted to accomplish. On April 21st, 1854, he met Eskimos at Pelly Bay, who informed him that they had been told by another group that there were men dead some distance away to the west. And Rae thought that the information was too vague to act upon. Instead, he carried on to Busia. His route is in the yellow line, tracing its west coast and discovering that the eastern side of King William Land was not attached to Busia, thus making it an island. And this strait was actually named later with Rae's name, Rae Strait here. Next one. This was actually the route that Roald Amundsen in 1903-1906 used next with its small vessel, the Ua, and he actually wintered in the place that is now called Ua Haven. And he was the first to cross the Northwest Passage, because having found that tiny Rae Strait protected from the heavy ice of King William Island on the west, protected from the east by King William Island and from Busia from the east, he could just navigate that part quite easily. Although it must be said, it is quite shallow water. So a big cumbersome ship like the Erebus and Terror may not have made it anyway, even if they had known that this passage existed. So Rae returned to Fort Hope on May 17 next, and he met some Eskimos at Pelly Bay. This time they had many more news about seeing these dead men. Can I have the next 2 slides, please? And they showed him objects that clearly belonged to the Franklin expedition, items that John Rae bought. Notably, next one was the Guelphic Order of Hanover. That was definitely Sir John Franklin's. Next, because he's wearing it in this portrait by Neglen. More objects were acquired when other Eskimos brought them to Rae at Repulse Bay. Because of logistics, Rae decided not to go and see for himself what the situation was on King William Island. Instead, he hurried back in order to reach England, and with the news and reasoning that by doing so, he might have prevented other expeditions to go in search for Franklin in other different areas. What he didn't know was a number of things. One, that in March 1854, the Admiralty had declared the officers and crew of the Erebus and Terror officially dead and had awarded pensions to the widows. The Crimean War was occupying the British armed forces, and no official Admiralty expedition would be ever sent again. What I like to point out is that this expedition, I can have the next slide, please, that this expedition, which was in essence discovered the Franklin fate was not a Franklin search expedition, it was a geographical Hudson's Bay Company expedition. So he didn't complete the survey of Busia, but found information about Franklin and discovered that King William Land was an island separated by Rae Strait, and thus discovering this route, as we said, through the Northwest Passage. Next, and this was the problem. I just put this one just to remind people of the enormous controversy that hit John Rae when he reported to the Admiralty that according to what the Eskimos had told him, there had been evidence of cannibalism. Since this is a celebration of John Rae, will just leave this issue that caused him a real heartache and also spoiled really his chances with the British establishment. Could I have the next, please? And in all, Rae's greatest achievements were the overland exploration and surveying. He surveyed approximately 1,800 miles of Arctic coastline. Between 1846 and 1854, traveled more than 13,000 miles on foot, with sledges or small boats. And between 1833 and 1856, he traveled 23,000 miles, mostly on foot. And uses, you can understand that next, please, that his achievements, however, did not receive the recognition that they deserved, mainly because of his having gone native, which was considered demeaning by the Royal Navy and the establishment. And also his belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company, which was a commercial outfit, seemed to detract from the objective value of his discoveries. Next, please. Anyway, despite the fact that he never received a knighthood as he would have richly deserved, nonetheless, he did receive some accolades. In 1852, he received the Founder's Gold Medal from the Royal Geographical Society in London. In 1853, he received an honorary medical degree from McGill University in Montreal. Let's remember that in the time of John Rae, around about, say, 1820, 23, when he was getting his qualification as surgeon, the medical profession wasn't terribly advanced. So having an MD from McGill University certainly was very much appreciated by John Rae. In 1856, eventually, he got the reward of £10,000, which had been promised for whoever discovered the fate of Sir John Franklin. It took absolute months and months to get it. And there are very interesting papers written by William Barr about it. In fact, he presented a paper at the Rae 200 event in 2013 when we all congregated in Stromness. Also, he got a law degree from Edinburgh University later on in 1866. And in 1880, he was made Fellow of the Royal Society. That's definitely a recognition for his scientific studies. Next. After retiring from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1856, Rae made his base in London, giving lectures, writing articles for various learned societies, including the Royal Geographical Society. He was a student of Canadian ethnology and material culture, and his collections and the written accounts are recognized as valuable evidence of unique ways of life. More than a century after his death, the native people of the Canadian North have adapted to the modern world, but many are still continuing to practice the hunting and trapping skills that Rae so admired and emulated. Next. And we see, as everybody who is in Orkney knows the marvelous, marvelous monument honoring Dr. John Rae in St. Magnus Cathedral, and also his grave, the graveyard. He was, and still is, at least I think, the greatest art traveler and explorer. And this is what we wish to celebrate today in his native place. Thank you.
That is a fascinating story.
Thank you. And of course, go through the wonderful work of the John Rae Society, this marvelous house is going to come alive. That really is, I was so sad when I first saw it in 1992. That's the time that I came to the Orkney Science Festival 30 years ago. And we visited it, and it still had the staircase that's still standing inside. But it was such a shame that such a beautiful place and so meaningful would go in disrepair. So congratulations on saving John Rae's house.
And in the Orphir Hall this afternoon, I think the plans are to give them an update on the latest developments of those plans. So you've mentioned something that I think people will be very interested in indeed.
Thank you.
Pia, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
We're going to have a pause
Great
to
pleasure.
allow a round of applause for you in the Orphir Hall and from the viewers. A very brief pause and we'll come back. So Peter will be joining us. And in the meantime, Pia, warmest thanks.
Thank you so much.
And we're back now and say hello again to our good friends, the John Rae Society in the Orphir Hall, and the many people who are gathered there. And by the miracles of modern technology, we bring a second speaker. We've heard the story of John Rae and the Northwest Passage. Now we're going to hear the story of the Northwest Passage from a man who knows that territory so well. Peter Wadhams has made more than 50 expeditions to polar regions. He's the man who discovered what happens to the Gulf Stream that passes our waters and goes up to the Arctic, and many other discoveries over the years. So welcome, Peter, and we're delighted that you're joining us this afternoon with the story of the Northwest Passage. Peter, you need to switch on your sound. Your vision's on, but we need your sound as well.
Okay.
That sound on.
Right. Okay.
That's it. Excellent.
Right. Thank you very much. Anyway, I'm very, very happy to be here. I wish I were in Orkney with you, but medical science seems to have not reached the point where it can cure me quickly of what I got. So what I'd like to briefly sort of carry on the story of the Northwest Passage from Pia's account to the present day, and a little peek into the future of what happens to the Northwest Passage. And of course, there hasn't been as much change as we thought there would be. The Northern Sea Route, that's north of Siberia, has become now a regular trade route, especially for Russia. But the Northwest Passage is still quite difficult to access. It's not quite as bad as it was in the 19th century, but it's still not easy. So let's look at some of the things that have happened there. Next slide, please. First of all, of course, one has to advertise one's book, and this talks about how the ice in the Arctic has changed. Next slide. And something I'd really like to advertise, which has an Orkney link, is a movie called Ice on Fire, which was produced by Leonardo DiCaprio. We showed it last year at the Orkney Science Festival. And the local link is that EMEC, the European Marine Energy Centre in Stromness, is strongly featured in this film, and Neil Commode has become a kind of global megastar. And it's really very nice the way that they covered all the ways in which the EMEC is bringing new methods into play for renewable energy and getting power from waves. Next slide, please. Now, the Northwest Passage is this bit on the left, the complete mess of islands that you see. And we knew, here we are, we knew in the 18th century how to get into, in fact, starting with Henry Hudson, how to get into the northern part of Baffin Bay, that's region here. And where you want to get, if you're going to make a trade route out of the Northwest Passage, you need to get across to the Bering Strait. So the amount of unknown territory you have to cross is really not that huge. It's just to get you from here to here. But that turned out to be a lot more difficult than it looked. And the main problem was this string of islands and channels that lies in between the northern end of Baffin Bay and the Arctic Ocean itself, leading to the Bering Strait. So the first expeditions, next slide please. The first expeditions, as we've seen, were pretty terrible things. I mean, Rae was far more efficient at exploration than the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy was dependent on sailing ships, and given the state of ice in the Northwest Passage, you only get about 1 to 2 months of ice-free conditions, if that. So you sail in during the summer, you get stuck, like these ships have done, and you sit there wintering and getting scurvy and generally unhappy until the next summer comes, and then you make a rush to try and get further into the unknown. And the trouble is that rush sometimes doesn't get you very far. So this is one of the early 19th century expeditions with Beechey Island in the background, which is very famous because some of the Franklin relics were found there. But this was a pretty grim way of making progress to the Northwest Passage. The only advantage was that sailors loved it because they didn't get the sort of fevers that they'd encounter if they volunteered for West African service. Next slide, please. Now, what drove people on was the hope that this could be a lucrative trade route. And what fed that was a completely ludicrous idea that was occurred in the mid to late 19th century called the Open Polar Sea. This was obviously an armchair explorer called Isaac Hayes, who said, if you head far enough north in the Northwest Passage, suddenly the ice will disappear and you'll come into open water, and in that open water, you can sail all the way across the Arctic and down into the Bering Sea. So this is his map of the non-existent open polar sea, and the red are the open channels that supposedly connected you to the open polar sea. Needless to say, nobody ever found the channels to the open polar sea. Next slide, please. Here we are. Well, then we had the actual successful transit of the Northwest Passage, which was with Amundsen in 1903, as Pia has shown you his ship. And the advantage of that ship was it had power, so it wasn't stuck for 10 months a year. So we now had the Northwest Passage navigated, but nobody was paying much attention to it. And nobody was paying any attention to the climate. This was the first thing that we unearthed about the climate of the Northwest Passage was the American consul in Bergen in 1922 said that everybody who works in the Arctic was saying that it was warming up. So this was the first evidence that the Arctic is warming up, and it dates right back to 1922. Next slide. But this was the general view, that we had a stable kind of situation where during the winter the entire Arctic is ice covered, and all the seas around the Arctic as well, peripheral seas, Bering Sea, Sea of Okhotsk, and therefore you can't navigate obviously through this. In the summer, the ice retreats a little bit, and if you're lucky, you can coast around the coastlines of Siberia and Alaska, but you can see that the ice doesn't necessarily retreat from the Northwest Passage itself, from these islands. So it's still extremely tough to get through this in summer, even when supposedly the climate is warming. So this is the situation that prevailed right until that part of ancient time when I was starting to work in the Arctic at the beginning of 2000. Not 2000, 1970. Let's look at, next slide, please. Okay, so very few ships had actually made it through the Northwest Passage at that time. And I was lucky enough to serve on the 6th ship to get through the Northwest Passage, which was the Hudson, Canadian icebreaker. And that sailed through the Northwest Passage in 1970 as part of a complete circumnavigation of the Americas, something which has not yet been duplicated. So there's the Hudson, 1970. Next slide. And here she is, seen from a helicopter, bashing her way through multi-year ice. That's this very heavy, thick ice, 3-4 meters thick, which you have a lot of trouble getting through. In this case, it was broken up, so it was helped a bit. Next slide. Then supposedly the Arctic was warming and clearing, but it didn't clear that much. So this is 1991, and a little while later, in which I was again in the Northwest Passage with 3 ships, and this one is the Terry Fox, which was a Canadian government icebreaker whose job was to help shipping in the Northwest Passage. This was the Frontier Spirit, which was an ice-strengthened cruise ship, which the Japanese were very, very bravely trying to send through the Northwest Passage. And this is the San Roque replica. That's a replica of the ship in 1942 that the Canadian Mounted Police did the 2nd Northwest Passage, 1942. So we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of that with the replica of the San Roque. So here we were, but you can see that we're stuck. And this was right in the middle of the Northwest Passage, very close to where Franklin's ship sank. And I could almost put that on this photo, but I haven't done that yet. But we were getting stuck in the very place where Franklin got stuck. Next slide, please. So a brief break to look at the natural beauty of the Northwest Passage area and the fact that it's all under threat. Polar bears, for instance, it's now the case, despite that previous slide, that the Northwest Passage is breaking up, the ice is disappearing, and so animals that depend on the ice are going to be really under threat. And one of those is the polar bear, of course, which needs sea ice to hunt on. Next slide. And wolves which are land-based but still hunt out over the ice. Next slide. Narwhal, which really live in the Northwest Passage area. They migrate out during the winter, but live there in the summer. Next slide. And the walrus, of course, which grubs around on the seabed for mussels and shellfish. Next slide. And of course, masses of Arctic birds, millions of them. This is a former, but you'll find in summer anyway, millions of birds in the Arctic. So it's really a naturalist paradise. But it is changing. And 2012 was a year when we had exceptionally warm conditions in the Northwest Passage. And one of the things that happened was that normally you expect ice and snow to remain in the Arctic most of the year. And that's what you think of the Arctic, as something covered with ice and snow. But in 2012, the brown area here shows land that became ice-free in June, which is usually, it's not yet summer. This is meant to be winter conditions, and yet the ice and snow had gone. And you can see that in Alaska, the Canadian Arctic, the Northwest Passage, and Siberia. That was really a wake-up call to the fact that the climate is really warming in the Arctic very rapidly. Next slide, please. So we have to study this, and that's a huge effort is going on today to study the changing Arctic, simply because it's propelled by the fact that the Arctic is changing extremely fast, and that has a knock-on effect on the climate of the world. So we've talked about this in other meetings, but the kind of religious aim of studying the Arctic is now to understand the rapid changes that are occurring, why they're occurring, and we want to be able to predict the future rate of change, because the future rate of change will involve a big loss of ice, which will include things like a big rate of increase of global sea levels. So next slide, please. So what kinds of things are we doing? Well, this is just one typical example. We don't really know much about the ice itself and what it looks like on the underside. You can see the white stuff on the top, but on the underside, you're getting ridges where the ice is pushed down, and you have a completely different kind of rugged topography of ice on the underside. And we can study that using submarines, but now an easier way is to use unmanned vehicles called AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles. We put them in under the ice and run them around under the ice with upward-looking echo sounders, and we can get these beautiful charts, really, of the underside of sea ice, looking at the pressure ridges where the ice has been pushed down to form these very impressive under ice ridges, maybe 50 meters deep, and pinnacles. It's really a marvelous topography made possible by modern technology. Next slide. This is just what it looks like on the surface when you do this job. You have a tent where you dig a trench and you insert your AUV through the ice, and you then control it with a computer, and it runs a track all around this region and tells you what the ice thickness is. This is where we live. This is a hut and food and sleeping. And that's, I don't know if you saw when I was showing the previous slide, there was a big set of ridges in one corner, and this is the same ridge. In fact, looks like the Sphinx, but it's actually an ice ridge. This is what you see on the top, and you see a lot more on the bottom. Next slide, please. Well, of course, man couldn't leave this alone just to enjoy the beauty of the Arctic. He has to start doing things with it and making money. So oil exploration has started in the Arctic, and these are the sort of vehicles that are used. This is a floating oil drilling platform, and it's ice strengthened, but to avoid it getting forced off its station by ice, you have another ship, an icebreaker, endlessly circling round, releasing goodness knows how much carbon dioxide, in order to break up the ice around the drilling platform. This is how oil exploration has started in the Arctic, but I'm happy to say that it's actually stopped. And I'm not sure whether that's because the oil industry has seen the light, or simply because it looks too expensive and also dangerous given what happened in the Gulf of Mexico. So this was an exploration by Shell, which came to a sudden halt one year, and they went away and haven't come back. Next slide, please. Now, this is the present state of the Northwest Passage, and you can see it's become a very, very busy place indeed. If we look at the green stuff, first of all, these are things which haven't happened yet, but will probably. And one of those is there will be a trade route right across the center of the Arctic Ocean. And that will make it the saving in distance between Bering Strait and the Atlantic is greatest if you head straight across the North Pole. And with the quite rapid disappearance of the ice, this is going to be the trade route of the future, the Central Arctic Ocean route. At the moment, all these other little lines are routes used by the Russians to bring export or iron ore and so on, and to supply bases. On the Northwest Passage side, we can see there are 5 different routes you can follow to get through the Northwest Passage. And some of these, as Pia has shown, are actually very shallow water. That's around here. So you can't, with a large ship, there's only one real route, and that's through Lancaster Sound. That's this route here. But smaller ships can follow the other ones. And when it says draft, it means you've got a problem with draft of the ship. You don't want to go there. So here we are today. We can sail happily right up to the top end of Baffin Bay, but the problems that the ships have to get through the Northwest Passage and then be able to get round to to Chukchi Sea are not that different from what people had to put up with in Victorian times. The Northwest Passage is still a barrier, and it still varies a lot from year to year. Next slide, please. One of the dangerous things that's happened is that the cruise ship industry has spotted this because it's so beautiful. There are wonderful icebergs to be seen. So you have now a whole load of ships going through the Northwest Passage. The Crystal Symphony was the first about 3 or 4 years ago. Now you're getting ships every year. And of course, it's extremely dangerous because these ships are not ice strengthened at all. So if they hit one of these nice, cuddly looking icebergs, the ship sinks. And that's already happened once in the Antarctic. And so I think these are, when I see these pictures, I think they're horror stories, that there's a real danger which people are not taking account of properly. So I would unless you really want to see the Northwest Passage, I'd steer clear of going in a cruise ship that isn't ice strengthened. Next slide. The ice area is going down all the time. Of course, this is the summer ice extent for the last 40 years. We can see it's linearly decreasing, which means that before many years have gone, the ice itself will have gone. Next slide. These are some of these recent years, and we can see how it varies. In 2007, it was completely free in the Northwest Passage. You could just sail straight through. But if you're trying the other way in the Northern Sea route, there was ice blocking right up to the coast. So you could do the Northwest Passage, you couldn't do the Northern Sea route. The next year, well, actually 2 years earlier, you couldn't do the Northern Sea route, and you couldn't do the Northwest Passage either. Next slide. This is so far the most ice-free year there's been. It's hovered around this ever since, and we can see huge amounts of open water on the Siberian side, so you can easily get around that way. But if you want to go through the Canadian islands, then you've still got some ice there present, and so the Northwest Passage still exists as a barrier to shipping. Next slide. This is 2019, and we can see that even in 2019, when the ice has gone away some more, it's left the Northern Sea route clear. You can sail happily from Bering Strait to the Atlantic. But again, if you want to go through the Northwest Passage, you've got blockages on nearly all these channels. Next slide. So this is the next but last. This was last year, the most, again, a year you think of as completely ice-free, but it wasn't. The orange here is heavy ice that was occurring all the way along. This is Greenland, the north coast of Greenland and Ellesmere Island. And that would mean that's good for a polar bear because it can hunt on this ice. But it's meaning that Northwest Passage ice is still not going away, although we can see there's very little ice left here in the middle of the Arctic. Next slide. And this is what it looks like if you're in the Northwest Passage and you're looking simply at the fast ice. That's ice which has grown naturally, and it's smooth, you can run over it in your dog sledge, and that's fine, except when it melts. Next slide. And this is what you don't get anymore. You still can get ice in the Northwest Passage, but we don't get this multi-year ice. That's ice which has grown and melted a little bit, then grown some more, and it becomes a really formidable barrier, a bit like a canyon, the Great Grand Canyon. So it was always hard to walk across the Arctic. It's getting easier now. Next slide. We have to work now, if we're studying the Arctic, we can work with ice-strengthened ships. This is an ice-strengthened ship which is frozen into the ice, and then you build up tents around it so that if the ice breaks up, which it tends to do, you can retreat onto your ship, and if your tents start blowing away. So this is called the Tara. It's a French research ship. Next slide. And finally, this is my final slide. It's a view of the future, and also, I think, a celebration of Scotland, because this is what's been recommended as a very good way of being able to save the planet and to cool the planet especially. And it was developed by Stephen Salter at the University of Edinburgh, and it's called marine cloud brightening. What you do is you have these unmanned vessels sailing around under computer control, and there's pumps which pump seawater up the middle mast of this mast. This is called a Fleckner rotor. It's actually a propulsion system, but you pump water up inside and then release it from the top via very finely divided nozzles, which produce very finely divided droplets of water, which are released into marine clouds. Those typical boring grey clouds you see are quite low in the sky, and the ice or the water getting into those clouds brightens the cloud, and it reflects more of energy out into space. So in fact, it's a way of cooling the planet by increasing the brightness of clouds. And it's a brilliant idea, and Salter's developed it. But of course, like all brilliant scientists and engineers, he hasn't been funded properly to build these systems. He needs about 300 of these, he reckons, will be enough to reduce the temperature of the planet by about 2 degrees, which is just what we need. So we hope that the Northwest Passage will see 200 or 300 of these vessels sailing around, releasing droplets into clouds and making them brighter. So that's what I would really love to see as a way of saving our planet. So I'm wishing Stephen Salter the best of luck in getting the funding he needs. Okay, that's a very swift look at how the Northwest Passage has developed and how it may develop in the future.
Peter, that was absolutely fascinating. And those images, as indeed Maria's images, beautiful images, haunting ones, fascinating to watch. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand back to Andrew in the Orphir Hall, when I think a number of people are looking forward to giving you a very hearty vote of thanks. And from us here, we'll say bye now, and over to you, Andrew.